Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here with us today. I'm Jay Griffin, the chair of the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. Also in attendance with us virtually are Commissioner Jennifer Potter, Commissioner Leo Suntian, a number of members of our staff, Carolina Shida, our Chief Counsel, Dave Parsons, our Chief of Policy and Research, and Noah Ching, our staff attorney assigned to this docket. The purpose of our status conference today is to first for the parties and the relevant stakeholders in this docket to discuss their positions and what they believe the primary elements should be in Hawaiian Electric's greenhouse gas analysis for this application. As noted in Commission Order number 37182 that was filed on the docket on June 19, 2020, Commission believes that a greenhouse gas analysis needs to be completed regarding the application in order for the Commission to carry out our mandate under HRS Section 269-6B. Second, the Commission will elect the parties and relevant stakeholders' positions on the feasibility of the timeline for this docket, given Hawaiian Electric's requested August 4th, 2020 Commission deadline date. Commission has concerns with that date is too short of a time period for the application to have adequate review by the parties and the Commission, especially given the need to conduct greenhouse gas analysis. Third and finally, Commission would like the parties and relevant stakeholders' perspective on fuel supply security. Commission is concerned with Hawaiian Electric's statement in the application about a potential fuel supply interruption. We'd like more clarity on this issue, as well as the parties and relevant stakeholders' opinions on how to mitigate any potential interruptions to the fuel supply. So a few comments on format and agenda. And first, I did neglect to mention this docket 2020-0090 application to approval of the First Amendment petroleum fuel supply contract between Hawaiian Electric and Par Hawaii Refining LLC. So a bit about the format and agenda today. June 19th, the Commission filed our order that included a WebEx access for this meeting and agenda for the status conference. With the link, the public will be able to view the status conference, but not able to provide comments. Any member of the public or organization seeking to file public comment regarding the matters in the status conference should email the Commission at puc@hawaii.gov, reference docket number 2020-0090 in the subject line. As always, we accept public comments. Please reference the docket number. As I stated earlier, Commission's recording the status conference, and that this recording will be available on our website and incorporated into the record. As far as our procedure today, we've set aside 60 minutes for starters for comments from the various different parties and participants that we've invited here today. And so we ask you that you discuss your positions on and what you believe the greenhouse gas analysis should contain for this application. Number two, your position on the feasibility of the proposed timeline for this docket, given that. And three, your perspective regarding fuel supply security, given statements made in the application. We've set aside the rest of the remainder of the time for Commission comments and questions and discussion of next steps. So roughly, if you break it down, that's about 12 minutes by the invited parties. So starting with Hawaiian Electric, next the Consumer Advocate, next PAR, followed by Life of the Land, and followed by State Energy Office. So please, offer your comments. And we recognize that this has been done on short notice, and basically we are trying to bring together the key parties that have been identified so far to help us resolve what we see as a number of gaps and concerns that the Commission has in what was filed, our timeline for addressing this, and the importance of fuel supply security here. And so we're looking for your feedback on what's necessary to rectify some of these things, how we can manage that in the requested timeframe or address that. And so in your comments, please try to focus on those three topics that we talked about. Again, the need for greenhouse gas analysis, more so given our statement that we certainly believe it needs to be done. What are the best methods to resolve this given the timeframes? What is a reasonable timeframe given the request by August 4th? And then your perspectives on fuel supply security and the matters before us here. So we ask each group, your representative to start off with your perspectives on these as we go through, as we make it through the 5 different parties. As I said, the commission will start with questions and we'll have continued discussion and follow up from there. Is that clear enough? We appreciate it. We recognize this has been on short time frame, but we're trying to be responsive given the importance of the matters and the timeline. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Viola from Hawaiian Electric.
And I'll quickly turn it over to Mr. Eisler from Hawaiian Electric, if that's okay. Bob? Bob, you there? He told me he was on, but he was having some trouble with the video. Bob, I hope, please unmute yourself. My greatest fears are realized, Bob. We're over this, but okay, you know what? We're going to go to Plan B a little bit until Bob can vocalize. And first of all, Chair Griffin and Commissioners, thank you for having a status conference. We realize this is a tough position we put the Commission in. We feel like we're in a tough position. Bob, are you there at this point?
Hey, Joe, this is Dave Parsons.
Oh.
I tried unmuting Bob, but he told us he was having some trouble connecting, so he might just need a couple more minutes to get in.
Okay, well, I'll do the best I can until he comes on. Again, Commissioner, we realize we put you in a tough position here. We do think we've laid out a plan for, even in the short period of time, we think there is a plan here that can basically get the Commission enough information that it can make a decision at least on an interim basis, and then take time to actually develop a more full record. We do. I just want to address up front. In our application, we had a statement that we're not sure that GHG analysis is required. We also dropped a footnote in there. Obviously, the Supreme Court case came out the same day. So we clearly agree GHG impact is required, and we're prepared to develop a record sufficient to allow the Commission to perform its statutorily required duty. I think what we proposed is, at least in terms of a possible schedule for the Commission, was something that was done back in 2008, 2009. Unfortunately, we were in similar tough circumstances back there. Gave the Commission the opportunity to do an interim approval, subject to the condition that we wouldn't be subject to basically have to, forfeit recovery of fuel cost purchase in the meantime between the time of an interim and the time of a final. Back in the day that happened, we got an interim approval from the Commission, got a final approval from the Commission. What's changed now is obviously the recognition that we have to do a GHG analysis. I'm gonna kind of maybe put Brendan Bailey, one of Hawaiian Electric's attorneys, on the spot here a little bit to discuss how we think a potential for the Commission to make an interim approval, make an interim finding in terms of 269-6B, and then have additional time after that to make a decision. So, Brendan, maybe you can jump in here.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. So, we discussed this internally, and our initial thoughts on this are based on the language of 269-6B itself and recent guidance from the Hawaii Supreme Court. We know a couple things that a quantitative or a qualitative analysis is definitely needed to substantiate any findings that the Commission makes regarding greenhouse gas impacts, and that those findings have to be sufficient to allow a reviewing court to track the steps by which the Commission ultimately reached this decision. So based on the Hawaii gas decision, we also know that we need to consider the greenhouse gas emissions beyond the state borders. So as Joe was saying, with respect to the interim decision, based on the nature of the amendment to the fuel contract, we believe that the Commission could actually perform a qualitative analysis that should be sufficient for purposes of meeting the Commission's statutory obligations under 269-6B with respect to the issuance of the interim decision. And that's based on our reasoning that the Commission can make the following qualitative findings and observations. So the material terms of the original fuel contract and amended contract are identical, but for the pricing. Second, the amended contract is facially neutral with respect to the fuel sourcing, including the extraction, development, production, and transportation, which may occur in-state and out-of-state. Third, the amended contract is facially neutral with respect to the state's reliance on fossil fuel, on price volatility, export of funds for fuel imports, fuel supply reliability risk, as well as greenhouse gas emissions themselves. And fourth, that the hidden and long-term cost of the subject fuel supply remains the same under the original versus the amended contract. That said, for purposes of the final decision, as Joe mentioned, we believe that a more further or detailed quantitative analysis can be done for that final decision. The scope of that quantitative analysis is obviously to be discussed and yet to be determined.
With that, I'll
Joe, can you hear me now?
Switch back. We can, Bob. Bob, let me
Okay.
thank you. First, let me just finish up on maybe real quick on the timeline issues, and then turn it over to Bob for you to talk about the few security issues. In terms of timeline, we realize again this is a tight timeline. We have reached out to Mr. Curtis to discuss potential procedural schedule. We actually have developed internally 2 procedural schedules that kind of a real kind of conceptual one to get us to July 13th, which is obviously tough, but at least to get us to August 4th. We will share those with the consumer advocate. We'll share those with Mr. Curtis. And we know that the deadline for intervention period runs through June 29th. So we'll have to see if someone else comes in. But we will propose a schedule. We're not going to wait on that for, a ruling on intervention to propose that. It's obviously a tight schedule. It would require us to turn around IRs in a week. Obviously, that's our obligation to do that. Would have allowed for statements of position or initial statements of positions for an interim. And then obviously we could have, assuming the commission was comfortable with that, we could have a longer schedule afterwards, potentially with an evidentiary hearing. With that, I'll turn it over to Bob to address the third topic, fuel supply security.
Well, I assume you guys can hear me now. Okay. So let me go, before I talk about fuel supply security, going back to the greenhouse gas analysis. I mean, we mentioned that we need to do that. You asked us to talk about what we think that would include. I think that there is the qualitative part that Brendan talked about. But going forward, I think we need to look at a full analysis of our fuel supply that looks at basically extraction, refining, and then use. Extraction is something that it won't be specific to any location. We're looking at more of a generic look at extraction, maybe possibly even looking at 2 aspects. One, if the oil was to come from the U.S. mainland or Canada, or 2, if it would come from elsewhere, because those extraction methods might be different. And then on the refining side, hopefully using some data that's already out there and available to look at ranges of different refineries, and then looking at where the Par refinery fits into all that. So that's what we're looking at, kind of methods, and we have had some discussions with Life of the Land and Henry on that. Going back to fuel supply security, our position is that we're not looking to buy fuel that we don't get certainty that we'll get recovery on. Right now, that has to be done through an approved contract. The only contract that we have in place that could provide us with those type of volumes right now is the contract we have with Par, and now the amendment to that contract. If that amendment is not approved, then Hawaiian Electric has said that by August 4th, if it's not approved, that we would cancel that amendment, which would take us back to the original contract that we have. Par has expressed that if we were to do that, that they would potentially give us notice of cancellation of the entire contract. If that's to happen, what are all our alternatives for other fuels? We could try to get biofuels. That's not going to work in the time frame or at the levels, and we don't have any other options. At that point, we would have to take this to put this in the court's hands by filing a stay or an injunction or both. And if we need more detail on that, Brendan can discuss how that might work. But the challenge is that with this time frame, we would not be in a position to have an approved contract. That said, we have gone out with a request for proposals for imported fuel to cover the tier 2 volume that's discussed in the amendment. We expect to get responses from that mid to late July, and we'll evaluate those and see how those would stand. But in order to, we still wouldn't have an approved contract. So that would put us in a bind as being able to buy fuel that we have certainty that we'd be able to get recovery for.
And maybe with that, we'll wind up this portion, but obviously we're going to be around to answer questions. Again, I can't emphasize enough. We're in a tough position. The commission's in a tough position. Consumer advocate, everybody on the phone here is in a tough position. We wish it could be avoided. It is where we're at right now, but we have proposed a way forward that would actually allow us to continue to have this fuel supply, pay what we think is actually the next best price to the contract we had already in place. We've noted in our application some other benefits that we would obtain through the First Amendment. And again, we appreciate everybody's cooperation and working with us here. The greenhouse gas analysis is something we're all, I think, trying to find our way through what's actually required. And again, we actually look forward to working with Henry on this to buy some certainty. Certainty is better than all of us continuing to try and find out what's required. So with that, I'll kind of wind up our initial presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and the rest of the Hawaiian Electric team. I think now we'll move to Dean and your comments and perspectives from what you've heard and the questions at the topics that the commission posed.
Hi, can you hear me? Right, thank you.
Yes.
I guess I'd have to echo what Joe just closed with. I think we do find ourselves in a very challenging and difficult position. And I think if I heard Hawaiian Electric correctly, I appreciate the fact that what they've said in this conference is a little different than what they said in their application, because our position is that a greenhouse gas analysis would be required for the commission to reach its decision and order in this particular proceeding. And we had, we're still evaluating it, but we did think that to the extent that GHG analysis was necessary for an interim and that it could be a qualitative analysis, which would give us more time for a quantitative analysis as well as the qualitative analysis for the final decision in order. So along those lines, I think this also kind of leads over into the other issue with respect to the time. I don't think that we could have a full, complete analysis that would fully inform the commission's decision by the requested deadline in the application. But our office would certainly be willing to entertain a schedule that has an interim decision order. And I know we've done that before with other fuel contracts involving Hawaiian Electric as well as Hawaii Island Utility Cooperative. So if I can sort of, shift to that, just to clarify again, I don't think we could have, there isn't sufficient time to allow a final decision in order by the requested. I think, the only real path forward would be to have an interim decision in order to give us more time if that requested date that's in the application right now has to be adhered to. So I guess in a way I'm implicit or explicitly saying that we're open to the idea of having an interim and a final decision in order. And then as it relates to the fuel security, I think, again, that's part of the need for additional time to complete that analysis, because I think, that the analysis that will need to be done will need to reflect the current market we find ourselves in. The analysis that might have been done, say, 5-10 years ago, I don't think will suffice or be appropriate in this particular instance. We need to look beyond just whether or not what type of access Hawaiian Electric may have to fuel sources, but also whether or not the other resources that are anticipated to come online may be an additional source that needs to be considered in that evaluation. So I anticipate that'll, again, require more time than would be allowed by the company's requested date in the application. So I think that summarizes our position on the three matters identified by the commission, and I'm available for any questions, if any.
Thank you, Mr. Nishina. Turning now to representatives from PAR. Jim, you and your team, or just you?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think we can yield a lot of our time because I think the first two of the three issues are probably not for us necessarily to speak to. As the security supply issue, I think what we wanted to do was really restate a commitment that we've made since this all these discussions have started, and that is in the event that the contract does come to a termination, we've consistently said and want to continue to commit that we will be there to ensure that we will continue to sell HECO any production we have locally, and we'll work with them to provide, if there's imports are necessary, to provide our logistics assets for those imports at prices that have been pre-negotiated on those on the use of those logistics assets. And so, you know, from our standpoint, that's what we wanted to add with regard to the security supply. We have consistently said we don't believe this is a security supply issue because, you know, like I say, either we will sell product at a spot market based price, or we'll make our logistic assets available for use in importing product. I think that the issue is the one that Bob put forward, which is just trying to have a timing of an order that would allow them to know that they could recover those costs.
Okay, and so you have no further comment, at least on number 2 on timing?
No, other than, you know, that was obviously a big part of the negotiations. We're continuing, I guess, our first opportunity to sort of stop the bleeding financially would have been around July 9th. But through these negotiations, we've delayed that process and continue to sort of bear that financial burden through up to or through middle of August. So that sort of backs into the need for the order early August to allow the timing for HECO to make its decision as to whether to terminate the amendment or not.
Okay, is that summarizes your initial perspectives and comments?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next up in our list is Life of the Land and Mr. Curtis. Henry, you're on mute. Sorry.
There. Aloha, commissioners and staff. I'm Henry Curtis, Executive Director of Life of the Land. We are mindful of the PAR-imposed time pressure on this, and that's why we intervened very quickly, and we started having discussions with Hawaiian Electric very early on the phone and through the email. And when Hawaiian Electric indicated that they were proposing a specific confidentiality agreement, we signed that for this docket to encourage them to actually open up and allow us to see what's really in this docket. We have not seen attachment A, B, C, or D. So while we are in full agreement of a need to say bifurcate with an interim and then a final decision, the questions become, what is in the initial decision and how is it binding on the entities involved? If we do it a qualitative first and quantitative second for greenhouse gases, yes, that'd probably be good, and you might be able to do the qualitative one by the interim decision. The question is stuff in there binding on future commission decisions. The three real concerns we have are the fact that we haven't seen the whole document, that we want to know how binding the interim is, and will PAR, or for that matter, HECO, be more transparent and open in accessing information for the interim, and then close up and clamp down on answering questions for the final. Specifically, the second Supreme Court decision did not limit things to greenhouse gases. They also mentioned the ongoing public trust obligations of the commission, and that is not impacted by whether there's a change in the resource or not. It's an ongoing obligation. And how that is treated in the interim decision versus the final decision. So I guess we have a lot of questions, and we are very open to having discussions one-on-one, one-on-two, or through Zoom or Cisco. But we want to see how this can be resolved. Thank you. Oh, can I say one other thing?
Go ahead.
One other thing is that looking at the refinery has an interesting two issues. One, the refinery handles both for the utility and for transportation, but with EOT, some of that is being converted. So that's a issue that may be relevant to this. The other is fuel security. Are we talking only about the transfer from the refinery to the utility, or are we talking about the threat of a storm impacting, or the pipe system impacting arrivals? So I don't know about that. It's, I guess, your call.
Okay. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Mr. Glenn from the Energy Office.
Aloha Chair, aloha Commissioners, aloha everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. To address the 3 points, we'll try to keep it high level. I'll touch on the first 2 and then ask Chris Junker to touch on the third one regarding energy assurance. For greenhouse gas emissions and the analysis, we think it's important that the long-term and hidden emissions and the out-of-state emissions for leakage be addressed as stated by the Supreme Court decision. And we'd also would like to call attention to the Commission and the participants that these are not the only 2 statutes or the only statute addressing greenhouse gas emissions. There are 2 other HRSs that the Commission should be aware of and that the filing probably should address. In particular, HRS section 225P-5, the Zero Emissions Clean Economy Target. And in particular, in section B, it states that after January 1st, 2020, agency plans, decisions, and strategies shall give consideration to this target. So we highly urge the HECO filing and the Commission to consider that target. And secondly, Act 32, Session Laws of Hawaii 2017, colloquially referred to as the Paris Agreement Bill, is the bill that basically expresses that the state shall pursue mitigation and adaptation strategies in a way that is consistent with the Paris Agreement, the principles and goals as expressed in that. And I think in some ways that touches on the methodology question that will also be before you without getting into a particular method at this time, but just to highlight that as an HRS to keep in mind. And related to that, the statement by HECO at the beginning about location and their analysis being generic, I think there might be an argument for location-specific analysis in that there are many jurisdictions where greenhouse gas extraction and refining occur that do have greenhouse gas mitigation plans and actions in place that address the emissions that occur from those activities in that location, and whether those should be given consideration by the PUC or not in weighing the long-term and hidden costs of emissions. In terms of the timeline, I think we're open to an interim decision with a perhaps qualitative analysis on the greenhouse gas emissions at this point, but looking for something more quantitative for a final decision. And for energy assurance, I'll let Chris Junker touch on that, both in terms of the topic and the potential timeline requests. Chris?
Sure. Thank you, commissioners. I guess one of the things we just touch on is that we do agree with the consumer advocate that the energy supply security may be a little more complicated, especially going forward. While this is a contract for a specific product for one customer, it could have ripple effects throughout the entire fuel supply chain for the state. Depending upon the ruling on the contract, there could be potential cascading effects of moving from primarily in-state production of petroleum-based liquid fuels to what could be up to 100% direct importation of all petroleum and natural gas products, not just LSFO. And so the unique risks related to the energy economy and the energy system associated with all major petroleum products, both under blue sky and gray skies, should imports be disrupted, needs to be identified. And so HSEO does have an obligation to investigate the impacts of potential long-term refinery closure, which the parties have indicated is a possibility should the contract not be approved on Hawaii's energy ecosystem and outlook. So from that perspective, we see that a collaboration with industry is required so that a clearer picture of the statewide energy security and fuel vulnerability associated with potential outcomes is understood and recommendations can be made. Part of that essentially would be required to establish some sort of baseline for evaluating physical infrastructure and the distribution supply chain of fuel products in Hawaii necessary to support energy emergency planning and resiliency policies. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I was just finishing my notes. We're going to turn to commission staff. Questions of the various different parties here, starting with our chief counsel.
I just have one quick question for Life of the Land. Henry, you mentioned that you'd signed a specific confidentiality agreement with HECO, or maybe I misheard that, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what you meant there.
What I meant is that HECO suggested using a confidentiality agreement, I think from a MECO statement that was approved by the commission. And so what I did is simply took that exact confidentiality agreement, stuck on a clause to say it was applicable to this docket, signed it, and gave it both HECO and filed it with the PUC, so that HECO might be willing to show that what's in the confidentiality agreement, which might, within the 4 attached documents, which might help us to make a better and more helpful description to the commission now of what the issues of concern are for us. Is that covered?
Yeah. And that's all I had, Jake.
Okay, thank you. Dave Parsons, our Chief of Policy and Research.
Thanks. I just had one question just for Bob. I'm wondering, is there anything in the application or perhaps in the contract amendment that memorializes the fuel supply security commitments that PAR, that Jim mentioned that they have made to you all?
I don't believe that we have anything in the application that states that.
But can you confirm that they have made those commitments, or the commitments that Jim described, in terms of the access to the logistics, the facilities, and/or access to fuel in the event that the contract is canceled ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, they've made that commitment multiple times verbally. I don't know that we have anything in writing.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I had, Jay.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Santian?
I don't have anything right now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Potter?
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Life of Land. Hi, Henry. You mentioned in your discussion you talked about binding requirements on the utilities and the parties. Can you elaborate a little bit about what binding means to you and what that might look like?
I guess another word, to use what Jay just used, memorialized. What is it that would commit the commission to take a particular path or a particular solution in the final, or what can be amended? So what part of the interim decision is both fixed and might be problematic to our interests?
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. That's all for me.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully people can bear with me for a second. I've got, I think, questions that cut across a few people, but I think I've heard a consistent response of an interest or ability to do qualitative analysis for the interim. I guess what I want to pose, is it possible to do some sort of partial or initial quantitative analysis, particularly given that some of this work's already been done for other, I'm thinking of the West Oahu solar project. Again, some sort of partial initial quantitative analysis. I guess I pose that to Hawaiian Electric first, and then I guess ask for a response from Life of the Land. Because really what I think because one of the Hawaiian Electric respondents, we were looking for some level of certainty here. And I think where we're struggling is that given the timeline and the importance of this, we really, all of us here collectively, don't want to go down paths where we find ourselves, struggling for what to do next in litigation. And so I think we're trying to identify what are paths forward where people feel comfortable that we continue down. That's why we've called everyone together up front. So I guess I'm trying to offer, is there some, incremental, more rigorous analysis that could be done in that time frame that gives people some comfort, and then that is a path we continue to follow? And I do have a follow-up to the binding nature, but I guess I want to challenge the assumption that nothing quantitative can be done in a fairly short time frame, and then I guess ask for responses from Hawaiian Electric and Life of the Land first.
So if I may, Chair, let me start off and then kick it off to the more people with expertise on our phone. But we think we are going to certainly look at that. I don't think we're going to limit ourselves to the minimum. And I actually think what we want to do is continue what we've started. Is that we'll talk with Life of the Land, we'll talk with the State Energy Office, anybody who's willing to sit down with us and come up with maybe a plan for what might go beyond just a qualitative analysis for the purposes of an interim. So we will certainly explore that, and I'll ask maybe Bob and others to weigh in on that. But we're not proposing to limit ourselves to that. We understand from the commission standpoint, obviously, the more information we can give you folks to make more than just a quantitative analysis for the interim, the better for all concerned. So we'll commit to at least attempt to do that, and maybe Bob and others can weigh in more.
Yeah, this is Bob. I'll weigh in. Absolutely, we can do some quantitative, even for an interim. We've already started that process. We're working with a consultant that we've been using for greenhouse gas analyses. There are data out there that can be used for all three of the areas that I talked about: extraction, refining, and the actual burning of the fuel. And I'm not even 100% ruling out that we might be able to get it done for the interim. I think we just don't know And we'll have to work with the other participants to figure out how in depth we need to go. I mean, if we do need to do specifics on locations or specifics on refineries, that's certainly going to take a lot longer. But I think we can get some general data out there for the interim. That's our plan.
Okay, Mr. Curtis, can I ask you to for your perspective?
Yes. It would be, I think, up to the commission to decide whether HECO puts out a greenhouse gas plan that's qualitative and they put out a separate one that's quantitative, and then parties ask IRs on the quantitative one and they come out with a revised greenhouse gas one, or do we simply present concerns or an alternative quantitative analysis? So I'm not really sure how that all goes.
Can I make a request or offer something for consideration, which is continue down the path that you and Hawaiian Electric have started on, which is engage in dialogue, find out, what is of concern to life of the land and your constituents that you represent, and try and get the utility to address as many of those concerns as possible in the time frame, and then we continue to build on that as more time allows.
Yes, and I think the two things we've been talking about is, one, the range of refineries and where the Hawaii refinery fits onto that. And second is the range of localities and where specifically we get the fuel. So the general sort of end posts will be easier in the shorter time, and figuring out where PAR fits on the timeline, fits within those rulers will take more time. Now, the one other thing that's important to recognize is that in prior years, but not in the past year, it is my understanding that PAR no longer lists where they get their fuel from. They ended that a year ago. So getting location-specific data would have to be, I guess, under confidentiality agreements, and I don't know whether that would create resistance on PAR's part once they got the interim decision.
I guess I take that as I think I should have extended my request for cooperation broader, that I think a lot of this key information is in PAR's hands, and we ask that you work with folks to supply that, and so the commission and participants before us will have the fullest record we can at each of these points in time. That's the ask for everyone here. But Hawaiian Electric's worked on different methodologies. From what we've seen, there's more to fill in on the upstream side of this, the fuel supply, the refining. So we ask that we get cooperation there, but I guess at the same time, Mr. Curtis, the extent that you can work with these parties and help have some clarity and agreement on methodology, I think that's the ask.
We will commit to actively working on this in both phone calls and written and Zoom or whatever, to make sure that we can resolve this as quickly as possible. And we're glad that PAR would be joining the conversation. Hopefully the CA and the State Energy Office will also join in on these preliminary discussions.
I did not mean to be exclusive. I'll let the others weigh in, but yes, I think, again, the better we can foster more collaboration on this at this point in time in particular will be helpful. Okay, so I guess since Henry asked Scott and Dean, you're collaborative folks, so I assume that you're amenable to that.
Hi, this is Dean. We're certainly open to working with the other parties as it relates to the GHG analysis. One comment and question that I might it might be more appropriate in some of those discussions, but for Hawaiian Electric, I know they mentioned that one of the potential benefits of this new contract is that the carbon residue will be reduced from 15% to 12%. So I was wondering, you know, as part of the initial quantitative analysis you were mentioning, Chair, whether or not, you know, that would be potentially something that does have an impact on GHG that could be offered up as a potential benefit for consideration in the interim.
I don't know if I'm supposed to address that right now. I can tell you that the carbon residue is not going to have an effect on the greenhouse gas. That helps us from a mercury air toxic standard requirement, you know, MATS compliance. It reduces particulate matter emissions, but not greenhouse gases.
Thank you.
And this is Scott Glenn with the Chief Energy with the Energy Office, responding to your comment, Commissioner, that yes, we'd be happy to work with the parties on the method.
Sorry, I'm multitasking here. I've got other fires burning and emails coming in. Okay, I appreciate that. I guess one other big topic, but that was one topic in between. And the big topic is fuel supply, but in between, I did want to touch on the comments and questions about how an interim decision may be binding into the future. I mean, Mr. Curtis asked about it, Commissioner Potter asked about it. I guess we go down a path where we do have, you know, some level of collaborative improved analysis. The commission is able to make a decision on that in August. I guess, Hawaiian Electric, your perspective is we'd still have latitude to do full investigation of the details consistent with how we've done these decisions with prior fuel supply contracts.
Yeah, this is certainly, Chair. You would have, from our perspective, I think the tough part we have is the only part we would need to have binding is that, assuming that the commission felt comfortable enough to give interim approval, that the fuel purchases we make in the interim, between the interim and the final, we wouldn't be subject to having to forfeit those. Anything else, we think the commission has the full authority. It's just an interim. It's kind of your initial finding. So you would certainly have the opportunity to have a more full scale, whatever consideration the commission finds is necessary.
And so, for instance, if Hawaiian Electric was to find a better opportunity through the solicitation that you're doing in a final decision, we could, find another alternative route based on that. Does that make sense? I mean, right?
Yeah. I think so. Certainly, if that's available. Again, I think the fix we're in is just we need to continue to purchase fuel. We would like to purchase it under the First Amendment. But if at the end of this process there's a better alternative and we're not going to have to forfeit the money, we spent in the meantime, we're certainly open to that. We think that's always the commission's prerogative.
Okay, that's helpful. But I think what I take the position is that the impact would be prospective to whenever a final decision is made, not looking back between the interim and the final. That's your key sensitivity.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. So I know the last topic I wanted to get clarity on, because we've heard different comments, is on the fuel supply question. Bob, in your beginning comments and in the application, Hawaiian Electric has raised concerns about the impact on fuel supply, but I thought I heard it was more of a focus on your concern is about the cost recovery, more so than just pure, the fuel supply itself. Mr. Yates has continued his commitment that they will continue to serve the state, but I do want to highlight the questions that Mr. Juncker had. Was, I think, is this just to the LSFO to supply Hawaiian Electric, or all of the other the follow-on full slate of fuels that you supply for, you know, all the different markets in the state, all the different islands. So let me, I know that was a so let me start with Hawaiian Electric, because we have the supplier saying there's no supply risk. We have the buyer saying there's a risk. So I just want to understand why there's a difference there.
Yeah, I think you hit that on the head. As far as Hawaiian Electric physically being able to go out and buy fuel and have fuel available, I think there are options for that, and we will be able to do that. The question is whether or not is cost recovery for us and the mechanism to do that.
Okay, so that's a, I think, better context for understanding the statement in the application. And I guess, Mr. Yates, just so we're clear, that your commitment is not just to supply LSFO on Oahu, but this is for the state supply on the whole.
Yeah, you're referring to fuel to supply the utilities on the neighbor islands?
Electric utilities, but I mean, I think we're asking the broadest question possible. All petroleum products that are needed in the state. We want to, just having a commitment to serve one part of the market and have it fall apart in other, either whether it's different islands or just different markets, I think is why we have the energy. This is why we have such a big group here, and we have the energy office here. And I mean, this is a matter that rises to the attention of the governor. So I think we just want to be clear on the full extent of that commitment.
Yeah, we obviously, as long as we can justify being a refiner here, we have both the need and the desire to provide all the products that we currently produce out of the refinery to the different parts of the state. Our focus, obviously, in these discussions has been on our commitments to Hawaiian Electric and the neighbor island subsidiaries, but you know, our desire is to continue to provide product for ground transportation, the airlines, all of those customers and segments. And I think going also to the earlier question, I mean, if there is a desire to make these commitments to Hawaiian Electric in writing, us negotiate of what those spot sales would be if it came to that point, we certainly would do that. We've agreed with them under the interim or the amendment some terms for use of our logistics assets in the event that they import. Those would be honored, those prices, but we're happy to reduce that to writing and to address local supply, what those prices, those spot prices would be at.
Okay, I appreciate that. I just have two, maybe, just again, I just want to be very clear.
Can I add something to that?
Mr. Kurt, I'm not going to, I'll give you a chance, but I just want to be clear on two other aspects of that. Shoot, now I had the questions on the tip of my tongue, in my head. Well, no, what I want to be clear on again is that's kind of, I mean, under all circumstances, meaning any number of reasons that if the commission does not approve any aspect of this, if we fall behind on a timeline for any number of reasons, or all of this gets tied up in litigation, is PAR's commitment still to meet the fuel supply needs?
Yes, I think I understand the concerns. It's a challenge to make a sort of. I mean, we obviously want to remain in business. This fuel supply contract, the pandemic, everything going on, has certainly damaged our company financially. The inability to have this supply agreement with HECO would be a significant negative impact on our operations. At this point, for instance, we talked to you guys earlier about our need to go forward with a turnaround, which would allow our refinery to operate in the long term. We have proceeded with that. So we're making the assumption that all is going to go according to plan and that we can justify the $30 million expenditure on that turnaround. I can't tell you here today that if this falls apart and we, in one way or another, lose a supply, that we're going to continue to operate this refinery. I can't make that commitment. I can make the commitment that this is the business we're in, where we're going to do everything we can to continue in this business, that we have to this community, and we're going to, if at all possible. But it's a little difficult to make a blanket statement that under any and all circumstances, we will continue to be here. I hope that's understandable.
Mr. Glenn, well, I just want to ask that, well, that's helpful. Well, it's helpful to hear the additional caveats and conditions. I just also, again, want to, even if Hawaiian Electric were to move direction of taking spot market and consistent with the observation from Mr. Juncker, I mean, if this is done on short term, I mean, basically, does that force you to become 100% importer on these timeframes? And are you prepared to do that?
You broke up a bit there. I didn't hear the full question.
Is there kind of the concern that Mr. Juncker from the Energy Office raised, or the ripple effects, the knock-on effects of such a big customer? If you have to move quickly to import supply, is that going to disrupt the other? Well, basically, are you in a position to move to 100% import terminaling in this time frame for all of the state's fuel supply needs?
We have not answered that question internally. I'm confident that between our assets and the other assets that exist within the state, specifically IES's import facilities, that there would be sufficient capabilities within the state to meet all of the energy needs on a short notice. Certainly don't think that's going to be the result. We think that even if things were not to go well, there would be a ramp down period. It would be, if in fact we had to conclude that we were not going to continue to operate the refinery, that reduction in production would happen over time as we ramped up imports. So I feel confident there's the capability to manage the local demand, not put the state in a supply crisis.
Notwithstanding Mr. Curtis's questions we're holding, but I want to give Mr. Glenn the opportunity to ask any follow-up, given this is clearly in the office's mandate.
Jay, you asked the question I was raising my hand for. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Curtis, you had a follow-on or clarification?
Yeah, I don't want this to be solely focused on saying we're talking about greenhouse gases and that's the only issue involved. We've reviewed the dockets where the SNG plant was created or established and the 2008 rate case. We know enough about how the refinery works and the different parts and equipments, but we sat on Air Force, Army, and Navy boards monitoring cleanups of hazardous and toxic waste, the 2 fuel storage annexes that were in Waipio and Wahiwa, and the massive pipelines that the Air Force and the Navy have. So we're familiar with pipelines and stuff like that, but we don't want to exclude leakages, because if you look at some of the past time, there have been oil leakages in this state.
Okay, so I take the question, are other sources of petroleum-based pollution?
Oil-based pollution and oil chemicals, yes.
Okay. Let's see. I think that wraps up my questions for now. I guess, again, my fellow commissioners, do you have any, now that we've been through this, any further follow-ups? Start with Leo.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, piggybacking on the line of questioning that Chair Griffin had. So, right, there's an application before us for an amendment to the existing current fuel contract between ECO and PAR, right? There's some potential of a delay, but then there is a path forward with, right, an interim decision and then a final decision, and we still need to work out what parts of the greenhouse gas issue will be addressed for the interim, and then what parts are, right, to be done over time for the final. So say we don't make that first deadline for the interim, which is what ECO is requesting, right? A July 13th, 2020, but no later than August 4th. What are the mechanics now of the contract? Because I heard, right, that it might revert back to the old contract, which means at some higher prices, which means impact to PAR, right? Just that ripple effect from a business standpoint. But if someone can just clarify for me, what happens if we don't, right? There's one issue about, right, what contract and then what are the alternatives to go. But I just want to make sure in my mind that I'm clear, that everyone else is clear that that's what we're talking about.
If I can address that, Commissioner Assumption, just at a real high level. So there's the first date that we've asked for is July 13th. And if we got an interim by that date, that would be the best pricing for customers. But we realized that was real short. We spent a fair amount of time with the PAR folks, getting an additional amount of time till August 4th. Now, what happens on August 4th if we don't get an interim approval? Well, the ball is in the company's court at that point. Under the contract, we've negotiated the right. One of the things that, frankly, PAR was not agreeable to was to have this contract, the effectiveness of the First Amendment, be contingent upon commission approval. So, next best thing from the company's perspective, we had to have a way out because we cannot take the risk of potentially tens of millions of dollars of unrecoverable expenditures. So on August 4th, if we don't get an interim approval, we have until August 6th to basically terminate the First Amendment. Then the ball moves. So if that happens, we terminate the First Amendment. The underlying the current contract remains in existence at that point. However, at that point, the ball moves to PAR's court, and our understanding from PAR, and they can certainly weigh in here, is that that's an untenable situation for them. They've represented that to us. Our expectation is at that point they would terminate the underlying contract. So we're in a bad area here. We're not this is we certainly would like more time for the commission and certainly everyone involved to be able to review this. But I think the August 4th is the outside date for us, at which point we're going to have to terminate the First Amendment. Ball moves to PAR's court to decide what they're going to do with the underlying contract. Our understanding is at that point they would issue a notice of termination of underlying, and then I guess it's off to the races to the court. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and the underlying contract is the original contract. Right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Thanks.
That's right.
Okay, thanks. It's a little clearer in my mind. Thank you.
Commissioner Potter, any other follow-ups?
No, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Okay, and that, I think you've all given us a good opportunity to better understand the different perspectives. I want to thank you guys for your time. Again, we ask and encourage stakeholders to work together to address the greenhouse gas emissions and related analyses on timelines that will support the decision making. The commission will have further direction, but we want to encourage that to continue. In fact, encourage that it's happening already. And we'll continue to move this forward and find all the different means necessary to follow through in a timely manner. So appreciate your flexibility to meet and talk in this environment. Let's see. Yeah, Commission will continue to review the matter, and thanks again for everyone's time, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.